Sometimes you pick out a pattern or a quilt kit, and once the project is done, you sit back, look at it, and think, that could have been done a whole lot differently. That happened to me with a recent make, and in today's video, I want to tell you the story about how I made a quilt that was inspired by one of those inferior quilts. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, we're going to dive into the why and the how I made the quilt that you see hanging up behind me. Specifically, I want to tell you what I changed and why I changed it and how I feel like it made the second version of the quilt better than the first iteration. But before we get too far, I know some of you out there are already thinking, hey, I would love a pattern for that quilt. And don't worry, I've got you covered. In the show notes down below this video, there will be a link to a pattern on my website that you can pick up for this very same quilt. Before we talk about the how I made the quilt, let's talk about why I made it. I made it because I tackled a half-pack quilt kit and I didn't love the results. I felt like there wasn't enough fabric variety in the quilt and the pieces of fabric were far too large. And in the end, the quilt that was produced from the half-pack kit looked a little sloppy when it should have, to me anyway, just looked more scrappy. Have you heard of those half-pack kits, by the way? They're actually kind of genius. One of the quilt shops within a couple hours of me actually sells them. You buy 5 or 6 half-yard pieces of fabric that are curated to go together, and then you get to pick one of a few very easy, very quick, beginner-friendly patterns to accompany those half-yard cuts, and then at the end of your project, you have a lap-size quilt to put together. I did find the pattern easy to read and easy to understand, but I felt like the design of the quilt could have been a little bit different if we just made some changes. And so that's where today's video kind of comes in, right? I wanted to make a couple of changes to get a better scrappy quilt because the quilt that came out of the half-pack quilt kit just did not feel scrappy at all. When I sat back and looked at the original quilt, I started thinking about the things that I would want to change. And I already mentioned that I felt like the first quilt, the pieces were too big and there wasn't enough variety in that quilt. So what I wanted to do is envision a new layout, kind of playing on those same blocks where you have a square and a rectangle, a bigger piece and a smaller piece kind of joined together and having them topsy-turvy throughout the quilt. But I wanted to make sure that I was introducing more than just 6 pieces of fabric. And I wanted the pieces to be big enough to showcase the design of the fabric, but small enough that I wasn't working with 18-inch seams to put my block together. So when I took both of those things into account and started thinking about what I could do to make it different, I came up with another challenge for myself. What if when I designed this quilt and wrote the pattern for it, I only allowed myself to use fat 8s? So why did I choose fat 8s, you might be wondering? Well, for 2 reasons. The first one is more practical, and the second one is honestly a little selfish. The first reason why I chose fat 8s is because it is a very readily available fabric cut. This is something that you are likely going to have in your studio, and if you don't, you have fat quarters, and every fat quarter is, you guessed it, 2 fat 8s. And if you don't have fat quarters or you want to be super scrappy, guess what? This quilt could be replaced with scraps. So fat 8s felt like an economical, affordable, practical fabric to use, but I also wanted to use fat 8s because I had a fat 8 bundle I just absolutely wanted to work with. You guys, I had a fat 8 bundle of Olive's Flower Market by Lala Boutique. This was a fabric line that I was just absolutely in love with because I love most of the lines that Lala Boutique does. But it was already out of print by the time I started getting into quilting and was introduced to Moda Fabrics and some of the designers that I love that design for Moda. This is a fabric line that I put on my, if I ever see this, Lord help my bank account because I'm gonna buy it. I loved it that much. Well, about a year or so ago, somebody somewhere had their hands on a Fat Eighth bundle of Olive's Flower Market and they put it on Etsy. They sure did mark up that price, but they put it on Etsy. And it didn't take me much convincing to add it to my cart, check out, and have it shipped out to me. Once I got it here, it sat on my shelves for a while, just waiting for the perfect project. And as soon as I knew I was going to reinvent that attic window quilt from that live stream that I did recently, I knew I was going to use this Fat Eighth bundle and that fabric alone. Nothing else was going to be introduced into the quilt. I starched it, cut it, sewed it, and now I have a quilt top out of it. And honestly, I feel like it looks better in a quilt top than it does folded up in a little bundle on my shelf. So let's talk about how I put this quilt together. Well, it all started with getting each of those Fat Eights laid out and starched. I love working with starched fabric. There are a lot of options out there. Personally, I like to use Best Press and I buy it by the gallon. Some of you may not be familiar with Best Press or starching solutions, so let me tell you why I use Best Press. I use it because I feel like the solution helps reduce just a little bit of the fraying on my pieces. It also makes all of my fabric lay nice and crisp and flat for cutting, which is important. But the third thing, the most important benefit, is the starch solution, the Best Press, adds some body to the fabric that allows it to lay flatter, especially when I'm sewing it together, and reduce some of the stretchiness, so it's going to play with me a little bit nicer as I'm working with it. Now, there are a lot of starching and sizing solutions out there in the world of quilting. Like I said, I use Best Press. That's my go-to, but I know Acorn has some sizing solution. You've got Flatter, you've got Faultless, you've got a number of different things. My recommendation would be find the solution that works for your budget and your project. It does what you need it to do, and stick with that. Once the fabric was all starched, it was time to move on to the cutting, and this was really, really easy. From each of my 30 Fat Eighths, I was going to cut one fabric A, one fabric B, and then 4 of my fabric Cs. I do want to let you know, though, when you cut out fabric C, if you're following the pattern instructions, it's going to tell you from each of 30 Fat Eighths to cut 4 of your fabric Cs, which means at the end of your cutting, you're going to have 120 of those little squares. You're not going to need all 120 of them. You're only going to need about 112, I think it is. It's actually in the pattern, so don't quote me. Read the pattern. It'll tell you. So if there's a few fabrics that you want to leave a bigger scrap area for, just cut a little bit less of fabric C. At the end, you just need to make sure that you have 112 in total. You don't need 120. I designed this quilt to be super, super scrappy, and I wanted to lean into that. There were fabrics in my Fat Eighth bundle that were directional, and so I just decided to not overthink it. I did not worry about whether or not the print was perfectly straight. I didn't worry about the orientation of how I was cutting it. I just did the cutting. In fact, as I was cutting my Fat Eights, I took stacks of multiple pieces of fabric and just cut them all at the same time. Once everything was starched and cut, it was time to move on to sewing. And I'm telling you guys, I had this done in just a couple of hours. Super fast make. When you look at the pattern, you're going to realize that this quilt is all built around one block that just consists of 2 fabrics. Your fabric A, which is a square, and then your fabric B, which is a rectangle. You're going to need 30 of those blocks to make the center of the quilt. And it doesn't matter how you put them together. As long as you are attaching the rectangle to the square, you're good to go. So I just spent some time doing some chain piecing. I sewed my fabric B rectangle to my fabric A square, and then when it was all done, guess what? Pressing didn't matter whether I pressed up to fabric A or fabric B, because the seam between fabric A and B wasn't going to nest with anything else. So I just pressed all of those seams under one of the fabrics. It doesn't matter which one you choose, but I got everything sewed together and pressed. Here's where the magic comes in. The scrappiness and movement in the quilt actually doesn't come from the blocks. It comes from how we're going to lay the blocks out. What you're going to do is create 5 different rows of 6. In the odd rows, rows 1, 3, and 5, you're going to have 6 blocks across, and the block in the upper left position is always going to have fabric B, that rectangle, in the top left position. In the even rows, rows 2 and 4, you're going to have the opposite. The block in the left position is going to have fabric A, or the square, in the top left position. Now, for this particular step, building out the rows, pressing does matter because we're going to nest our seams as we put our rows together. So for rows 1, 3, and 5, the seams are pressed in one direction, and rows 2 and 4, the seams are pressed in the opposite direction. Do you know what nesting a seam is? Maybe you're new and you haven't heard of this. It's really a cool concept. When you have blocks that you are sewing together where the seams go in opposite directions, you have the seam bulk that really butts up against each other. If you do this right, you'll be able to feel it between your thumb and your forefinger. So what I like to do when I'm trying to nest seams is I get my fabric lined up along the raw edge, and I'll push those seams so that they're up against one another, and I'll rub it between my finger and my thumb. If the fabric is too far apart, you're going to feel a valley between the two seams. If the fabric is overlapping, you're going to feel a very thick bump. But if they are kissed up next to each other just right, you're not going to feel a super big bump and you're not going to feel a valley either. If they're nested right next to each other just perfectly, that's how you're going to get that really crisp point where all 4 of your fabrics are coming together between each of the rows. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, as I was building out these rows, I did get turned around a little bit. In fact, I had to pull out my seam ripper and fix rows 2 and 4. For some reason, I had it in my head that all of my rows could be built out the same way, and I would just take row 2 and row 4 and rotate them 180 degrees and everything would be fine in the end, but that's not how it worked. What I realized is because I have an even number of blocks in the row, if I start out with fabric B in the upper left-hand position, and then I take that row and rotate it 108 degrees, guess what? That same fabric is still in the upper left-hand position. The borders were really simple enough to sew. You were basically just taking those fabric C squares and building out big strips. Just add one, add another, add another, add another until you had the right number of squares put together to make your side and your top and bottom borders. Now, personally for me, I like to add my borders on the side first, and then I come back and do the top and bottom. And so that's how the pattern is written. But I do know that some folks out there like to do the top and bottom border first and then go back and add the side borders. It really doesn't matter which one you do. I did give you a pro tip in the pattern to let you know if you choose to add the side borders last, you need to make your chain pieces for your borders a little differently, and I gave you those instructions. Ultimately, this is a pieced border, and you're not going to really be able to tell whether you put the top or the side borders on first. It's just going to look like little squares that went around the perimeter of the quilt no matter what you do. Now, I will say adding those borders onto the quilt top is not difficult, but it is a little tricky and it does require a bit of pinning. I am quite pleased with how this quilt turned out, if I'm being completely honest with you. Right now, the quilt measures 52 inches by 64 inches, which is a great lap size. But if I wanted to make it a bed size and double the amount of fat eighths in there, oh my goodness, could you imagine how scrappy that would be? That'd be so much fun. I am a firm believer that a pattern is just a starting off point. This is a set of instructions and a project that I have designed, but along the way, if you're making this quilt and there's something that you want to change, you should totally feel free to do that. Patterns can be a step-by-step tutorial or a set of instructions for you to make a quilt, but sometimes they can be inspiration for you making your own creative project. So I've got to know, which of these two quilts do you actually prefer? The attic window quilt or the stepping stones quilt? Or do you like them both? And are you planning to make stepping stones? If you do, I would love to see your quilt top. Make sure to share pictures of it on social media and tag me in it. I can't wait to see what your creation looks like. Thank you, friends, so much for sewing with me today, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!